All right, guys. So we're now moving into the country of Iran. As always, we start with asking the question, why do we study this case? And the textbook makes a point of explaining how Iran is unique among many countries in the world in that it is associated with Islamic fundamentalism, which is also known as Islamism. Islamism or Islamic fundamentalism is this idea that Islam should be the primary source of the political regime. It's the main source of the political regime. We've previously discussed how fundamentalism is the opinion that religion is absolute and inerrant. Inerrant's a fancy word meaning without mistake, that should be legally enforced by making the faith the sovereign authority. In other words, faith is the ideology. No longer are we talking ideology in terms of liberalism or in terms of socialism or communism or fascism. None of those are the ideologies that matter for purposes of a fundamentalist. A fundamentalist believes that the ideology is the faith of the particular religion that the fundamentalist believes in. And so when we are discussing Islamicism, what you're hearing is a religious fundamentalist who believes that Islam and the beliefs associated with Islam should be the source of the political regime. And so when did Iran become an Islamic or an Islamic fundamentalist country? And this happened in the 1979 revolution, where centuries, if not millenniums, of rule by different Iranian shahs, a fancy word for kings, were overthrown in a revolution by a charismatic religious leader that's known as the Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, Ayatollah Khomeini is the first, what's known as the first supreme leader of Iran, where he served in that capacity as 1980 to 1989. A supreme leader in Iran is one of the institutions of the government. It's one of the main constitutional and political institutions that are found in the Iranian constitution. So Khomeini's Iranian revolution changed all aspects of Iranian life, considering how Khomeini and his followers tried creating a theocracy. A theocracy is a fancy word, meaning a government ruled by religion or by religious leaders. Khomeini's goal was to create an Islamic republic where law and politics flowed from Quran, the Quran being the main religious text of Islam. Now, the Iranian Revolution has become a primary source of inspiration for Islamist movements throughout the world. Now, the truth is there's a lot of complications, because while the leadership of the Iranian Revolution hoped to establish a domino effect where the Islamic Revolution in Iran could be used in other parts of the Middle East to create their own theocratic governments and regimes, the people of Iran do not necessarily want a broader pan-Islamic or country. It's important to keep in mind that Iran's ethnic composition is not Arab. Arabs traditionally are going to be the predominant ethnic group for most of the Middle East, but in Iran, it's not Arabs. In fact, Iran does not consider itself an Arab republic. It is not an Arab republic. The majority ethnicity in Iran, that's incorrect, is Persian. And the language they speak is not Arabic, but rather Farsi, okay? So Iranians are mostly Persians. They're not really Arab, and they don't speak Arabic. They speak Farsi. And in fact, most Iranians strongly dislike Arab countries, okay? So it's important to keep in mind that while the leadership of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when they overthrew the Shah and decided that they were going to create an Islamic republic that was going to be a theocratic regime, while they themselves hoped that there would be a similar series of revolutions throughout other countries in the Middle East, similar to how in Russia, the communists thought that there was going to be a communist revolution throughout the world after their revolution, similar to how the Chinese thought that there was going to be a Marxist revolution after the Chinese takeover. Iran also thought, the Iranian leadership thought the same thing, but in terms of their theocratic regime. The reality is that the average Iranian is not necessarily very interested in creating a pan or all Islamic or all an all Islamic tidal wave of revolutions throughout the world. So not only is Iran different from the rest of its Middle Eastern countries in the sense of how it has a different ethnic group, that's a primary ethnic group, but also Iran has a different religion than the rest of the majority religion found in the Middle East. So again, most of the Middle East is Arab, Iran is Persian. Most of the Middle East belongs to a denomination within Islam that is known as Sunni. However, Iran is not Sunni. Iran is predominantly Shiite, okay? And the Shiite religion is practiced by about maybe 10 to 15% of Muslims worldwide. And it differs from the rest of Islam as it pertains to who is the rightful heir of the Prophet Muhammad, okay? Because of this religious difference, many worldwide believers of Islam reject the Iranian theocracy because they think that it is a heresy being an evil misinterpretation of the correct, true religion. That's a term that's used in any religion. So for many Iranians, for many Muslims, the Iranian Revolution may serve as an example of how political change may look for the rest of the Islamic world. However, for others, it's an example of how religion and politics should not mix. And so there are very strong mixed feelings throughout the Middle East as to the success and applicability of the Iranian Revolution as it pertains to how it should be viewed in other Muslim countries. Now, important that as I'm showing you this map, most of Iran, as you can see here, is very strongly Persian. The yellow here shows how Persians are the predominant ethnic group. You'll see some pockets of Arabs at different parts, particularly as you get closer to Saudi Arabia, which is down here, right? So there are some very small pockets of where Arabs are present. You have some pockets where the Baluchi are present. The two main minority ethnic groups, however, in Iran are the Azeri, which are located right next to Azerbaijan, and the Kurds, okay? The Kurds are actually a minority group that are found within Turkey as well, and within stretches of Iraq. So they really stretch around this pocket of the world. The Azeri, I believe, form about 20% of the ethnic group composition in Iran. The Kurds are at about 14%. The Persians are at about 60%. And the rest of the 6% are Baluchi and Arabs, mostly, okay? Now, the modern day Iran has tensions. Okay, there are very real tensions within modern day Iran. One of the biggest problems that a modern day Iran has is its pursuit of nuclear capacity, where many in the West believe that the Iranian regime is simply using the desire to pursue nuclear energy technology as an excuse to truly seek nuclear weapons. And this has been a cause for much concern between the West and how it perceives its relations with Iran. In 2015, there was an international agreement where Iran and the West agreed to an agreement where Iran promised to not pursue nuclear missiles, or rather, Iran promised not to pursue nuclear enrichment, which is how their ability to get nuclear material past a certain point where they would normally be able to then transfer that material to making a weapon. But during the Trump presidency, the United States backed out of that agreement, and now we find ourselves in a similar position where the question is whether Iran is going to actually go ahead and pursue nuclear missiles, and that's an issue to this day. Now, domestically, for the last 20, 30 years, Iran has had a lot of domestic unease, a lot of domestic problems. In the 1990s, reformists tried liberalizing the political, economic, and social institutions in Iran, which are very, very strongly tied into supporting the theocracy in Iran. Okay, and so reformists in the 90s tried liberalizing the economy, liberalizing the political institutions to have other branches of government have a stronger say in the government as opposed to the supreme leader and the supreme leader's allies. And in 1997, they actually elected a person by the name of Mohammad Khatami, and President Mohammad Khatami tried strengthening civil society in Iran and tried pushing forth a dialogue of the various civilizations throughout the world instead of pursuing international conflict. However, as you're going to see, Khatami's hopes for long-term change were not really very successful. Religious conservatives limited the ability of Khatami to institute change, and in 2005, they elected a conservative mayor of Tehran, whose name goes, who's called Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And Ahmadinejad pursued a much more confrontational policy, particularly with the United States. When he went up for re-election in 2009, Iranians, most of the people thought, wanted reformist candidates that were going to be more peaceful and less volatile in the international scene. However, it seems as though the top leadership in Iran rigged the election to guarantee a second result or a second term for Ahmadinejad, and this led to mass protests, civil unrest in Iran. And then in 2013, the cleric Hassan Rouhani won a surprising landslide victory. He promised to have some reforms that were lost under Ahmadinejad, as well as improve relations with the West. However, like Khatami before him, Rouhani was limited by the conservative institutions and actors in Iran, such as the much more powerful supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei, who has been the leader in Iran since 1989. Now, while Rouhani won re-election in 2017, this was seen more as a vote against the hardline conservatives than a vote supporting his leadership, because many people in Iran apparently are very frustrated that he has not been more successful in accomplishing greater reforms in liberalizing the country. Now, like I said, it's important that we remember, as you can see from this map, that Iranians are a different ethnicity from the Arabs. Okay, again, Iranians, 60% Persian. Now, Iran is located primarily on the eastern side of the Middle East, and it shares borders with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other countries who were part of the Soviet Union. So here's Afghanistan, here's Pakistan. A lot of these countries, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, they were part of the old Soviet Empire. Iran is a very big country. It's about roughly the size of Alaska, and it's a little bit smaller than Mexico. And it has a population of 80 million, which is actually bigger than the population of the United Kingdom. In terms of land size and in terms of population, Iran is among the world's top 20 countries. Additionally, Iran's population is pretty young, especially when compared with Europe or others in North America. The median age in Iran is 30 years old. Now, because the population is so young, a lot of people within Iran do not have a memory of how the country functioned before the 1979 revolution. And so all they've ever experienced has been the economic stagnation that has been present under the current Islamic regime for the last 40 years. The state has certain problems. There is a large number of young people who want better access to education, employment, and housing. The government struggles to provide all these things. And the youth in Iran is very strongly in favor of liberalizing these institutions in Iran. They're very pro-reform. They were the ones that were leading the mass protests of 2009's supposed rigged election. And they're the ones who voted for President Rouhani in 2013 and again in his re-election of 2017. Now, like I said, there is diversity in terms of ethnicities in Iran. About 60% of it is Persian, 20% is Azeri, 14% is Kurds, and then the other two minorities that you're going to see, as I said earlier, are going to be the Arabs and the Baluchis. Okay. Now, the ethnic, and it's important to note that some of these ethnic groups are actually Sunni Muslims as opposed to Shiite Muslims. Remember, again, Iran is predominantly a Shiite Muslim country. For purposes of clarification, Muslims are the people, it's the name that we give to any person who is a worshiper of the religion or who's a believer of the religion of Islam. And so Islam is the religion, Muslim is the person who believes in the Islamic religion. Now, Iran's ethnic diversity actually leads to ethnic conflict post-1979. And while these conflicts have somewhat gone down, there are still some small ethnic tensions, particularly among the Kurdish minority. Again, the Kurds, not just in Iran, but also in Iraq and in Turkey, for a very long time, have wanted to have their own country. And so those ethnic tensions, particularly among the Kurds, persist today. The Azeri are not really as demanding for political freedom, but the Kurds are by comparison. Now, Iran does have natural resources. It has the fourth largest oil reserves in the world. Additionally, it also has the world's second largest reserves of natural gas, just behind Russia. And when you consider the size of Russia and consider the size of Iran, that's pretty impressive. Iran's resources have had positive and negative elements. On the positive side, their resources are what drew imperial attention in the early 1900s, where we're going to see that the Russians and the British went to Iran, and because of their presence, they were able to help Iran begin the process of modernization. In today's day and age, the oil reserves and the selling of oil in Iran has helped keep the actual current regime in power. Now, of course, there is also the resource curse element found in many other countries. It's found in Iran. A negative consequence of Iran's oil-derived wealth has been the fact that Iran has neglected to create or strengthen other parts of its economy, so that it's very dependent on its oil exports. Okay, there's stagnation when it comes to other parts of the Iranian economy. And so a very quick history. There's actually, I think I made about maybe 7 or 8 slides. Yeah, there's about 8 slides of full text regarding Iran's historical development. We'll try to get through them and hit the most important parts. The Iranians traced their origin from the Persians that came from Central Asia around 2 millenniums before Christ. Okay, and the term Persian continues to be a term frequently used to describe the majority of the country's population. It's important to keep in mind that until 1935, the official name of Iran was actually Persian. Now, about 1 millennial BC, the Persians actually create a massive empire throughout the region where they subdue other groups. There are several emperors that were part of this empire, and in some instances, this empire stretched from all the way India through much of the Middle East. The most important of this is the Achaemenid Empire, which rose during this time and was known for its wealth, technological sophistication, and religious and political tolerance, of course, compared to other empires. Now, the Achaemenid Empire remains to this day an important symbol of Iranian might that many Iranians remain very proud of. Now, this empire will eventually be destroyed by Alexander the Great, but the country would continue to develop through several other ruling dynasties. The names of the title that we give to the kings in Iran are Shahs. So whenever you hear Shah, it's a very distinct term that really refers to an Iranian king. We're going to fast forward to 7th century AD, where Islam is introduced into Persia. It is brought by Arabs from the Middle East. Before Islam, the popular religion in Iran was Zoroastrianism, which is a native monotheistic faith. Now, Zoroastrianism is going to give way, beginning in the 7th century, under the Umayyad dynasty, where the population is going to be slowly converted into Islam. Okay, and while Persia is going to be incorporated into larger empires for the next 400 years, some of the Persian practices and institutions are going to be absorbed into the broader empire of these conquerors. Important to remember, though, that there's going to be continual differences between the Persian and Arab culture in the region. Now, from the 13th century to about the 15th century AD, Persia is going to be devastated by the Mongols. Remember, the Mongols end up being a major empire that is going to stretch out throughout very large parts of Asia and even Europe. And Persia is going to be devastated by the Mongols, not just economically, but also through depopulation. However, once the last major Mongol leader dies, a new Persian dynasty is going to finally emerge. From the 1500s to the 1900s, there are going to be two main dynasties that we have to remember in Iran. The first one is the Safavids, which ruled from about 1502 to 1736. And during this time, the Shiite religion, the Shiite variant of Islam is going to be adopted as the country's state religion, as a means to actually differentiate the country from their Ottoman rivals, all of whom were Sunni. Now, the Safavids are going to be the ones who are going to create the term Ayatollah, which is a religious title. It's a high rank within the Shiite religion that is going to be achieved by scholars who have acquired a very advanced knowledge of both Islamic law and Islamic religion. So the word Ayatollah is actually going to be created, or the concept of an Ayatollah is going to have been invented by the Safavid empire. And the term Ayatollah to this day is very important within Iran. A second dynasty is going to be the Qajar dynasty, which is going to rule between 1794 and 1925. Now, let's discuss a little bit more in detail what it means to be a Shiite within Islam. Shiite believes that imams, or the direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, are the true political and religious leaders of Islam. Now, there were 12 main ones that happened that occurred right after Muhammad's death. The last one, the 12th one, I'm not sure if it's the 12th or the 13th one, but the last of these main imams is known as the Mahdi. And this is a hidden imam who will come back at the end of time to restore justice and equality to a corrupted world. This is not too dissimilar from what you see in Christianity with the notion that Jesus Christ will return at the end of time. Islam has, instead of a godlike figure, they have an imam. In Christian terms, Jesus Christ is God. But instead of having a God return, they're going to have a descendant, a direct descendant from the Prophet Muhammad, the last Imam, Mahdi, who has been hidden from the world and who will return to the world to restore justice and equality to a world that has been corrupted by evil. Okay. Now, Shiism is going to emphasize the martyrdom of the descendants of Muhammad. They were all killed, or most of them were killed by the Sunnis. The Shiite venerate a leader called Hussein, who was the grandson of Muhammad. Hussein is going to fight a revolution against the corrupt Umayyad Caliphate's kingdom in 680 AD. He is going to die a martyr, but is going to be remembered very fondly in the holiday known as Ashura. Ashura is the most important Shiite religious holiday, which commemorates his death. Now, the Shiites view their political and religious struggles within the framework of what Hussein did. So if Hussein died a martyr trying to fight against the corrupt Umayyad Caliphate that was hurting the average person, so too must the average Iranian carry up their pains and their struggles and continue living by the example set forth by Hussein. Now, the interesting thing about Shiism is that the emphasis of this Mahdi returning at the end of time to bring back Islamic rule the correct way makes worldly politics secondary to the faith according to Shiite religion. This is interesting because there's going to be a contradiction with the exact purpose of why the Iranians, or why the Ayatollah Khomeini created the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is going to be a source of contradiction because for many Shiites, religion and politics are incompatible, and politics and religion should be separate because politics will always be corrupt. And so for many Iranians that see the theocracy of Iran, there is a contradiction about trying to create a Shiite theocracy, given how Shiite teachings believe that there should be some separation between religion and politics, because politics will always be corrupt. So Shiism is going to be more structured, more centralized as a denomination of Islam when compared to the Sunni religion, or the Sunni denomination within Islam. And Ayatollahs, Shiite Ayatollahs, are going to be a very powerful institution in modern day Iranian religion and politics. Now, the Iran supreme leader has tried to place himself above other clerics. However, other Ayatollahs that are even found within and outside of Iran also have their own followings and their own fatwas. Fatwas are religious rulings that are independent of what the supreme leader in Iran, whoever the current Ayatollah is, states. Now, in the early 1800s, Russia is going to take territories from Iran in the north, and the United Kingdom begins taking territories from India, which is not too far from it, and also from Afghanistan. The British are going to start having a lot of influence up here in this eastern part, and the Russians are going to have a lot of influence up here. Okay. So by the mid-1800s, Iran is actually going to face a very strong existential crisis over how to survive these Western powers that are slowly but surely encroaching on the sovereignty of Iran or of Persia. Remember, again, at that time, the country was called Persia. Now, in the last decades of this Qajar dynasty, the monarchy led by the Shah is going to create certain half-hearted reforms that were really borrowed from the West as a means of trying to modernize the weak Iranian or weak Persian state. Again, this is happening in the backdrop of Iran losing sovereignty to both the British and the Russians. The public is very angry at how the government is very weak and how the weak monarchy seems to be selling off the country to Western interests. While the Qajar dynasty is trying to modernize the country and tries to not appear to be weak to the country. In 1906, there's going to be what's known as a constitutional revolution, where leaders, religious leaders, intellectuals, and merchants protest the power of the Qajar monarchy and want to limit its powers. And this results in the country's first constitution. That's why it's called the Constitutional Revolution of 1906. And as part of that first constitution, there's going to be created the first legislative body in Iran that's going to be known as the Majlis. Now, the Majlis is going to continue serving as the name for the legislative body of Iran to present day. Constitutional revolution is going to be the first attempt of Persia at creating republicanism and democracy, but it's not going to have a strong ideology or support system other than simply this notion that the monarchy should be weakened and removed. We're going to see how secularists, or people who believe that religion and politics should be separate, are going to have a battle, even as they're seeking to limit the Shah's power, with the Ayatollahs, who wanted to create a stronger Islamic country. And so, of course, this conflict between secularists and those who are going to want a stronger presence of Islam within the government, this is going to be something that we're going to see throughout the next 120 years in Iran. So it doesn't end there. If anything, this is the start of that struggle where what role should religion play in the government of Iran? Now, the constitutional revolution did not succeed in its goals of really limiting the monarchy's power, because very quickly the monarchy was attempted to abolish the constitution. And not just that, but the country eventually makes itself available for the United Kingdom and the Russians to divide it into formal spheres of influence in 1907, essentially eliminating Iran's, or again, Persia's sovereignty. Now, with the presence of World War I, several Persian factions start fighting one another, and a quarter of the country's population is going to get killed. That's a lot. 25% of Persia's population dies in World War I. And post-World War I, the United Kingdom becomes the dominant foreign power within Iran, and they actually occupied a large parts of Iran, again, back then called Persia. Now, this embattled national legislature called the Majlis continued to try to oppose British imperialism. They reject a 1919 agreement that would have given the United Kingdom significant control over the state and the economy, particularly over the country's oil industry. And much of Iranian history is going to then show itself, specifically modern Iranian history is going to deal with this issue of British imperialism. Even though Iran never became formally a part of the British Empire, this unequal relationship between powerful imperial Britain and weakened Persia are going to continue influencing, not just, are going to continue influencing Iran's mistrust of the British that lasts to present day. Now, in 1923, the last Shah of the Qajar dynasty appoints a man by the name of Reza Pahlavi, he was going to call himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, as prime minister. And Reza Shah quickly is going to have power. He's going to consolidate power by eliminating threats within Iran and outside of Iran. He's going to centralize the military under his control. He's going to deal with several rebellions and actually limit British and Soviet interference in Iran's affairs. By 1923, the last Shah of the Qajar dynasty leaves. They go into exile. And by 1925, the Majlis officially eliminate the Qajar dynasty as the ruling dynasty in Iran and appoint Reza Khan as Iran's new Shah. Of course, he creates a dynasty that he calls the Pahlavi dynasty. It's a word that comes from before Islam. And so yeah, he actually gave himself the Pahlavi last name. Now, initially, Reza did not seemingly want to rule as a monarch. Instead, he wanted to rule as a powerful, unelected president and a republican form of government. But the clergy in Iran were scared of a secular republican government. They thought that it would be an attack on their faith. Again, this was, remember, the fight between the secularists and the religious clergy in Iran. We see that again here in the 1920s. And they wanted to have a traditional form of rule, which resulted in Reza Khan creating a powerful monarchy in his quest to modernize Iran. So this monarchy is going to remain in effect from 1925 to 1979, which is impressive considering how by that time, most of the world had actually eliminated strong monarchies having any form of power. Now, Reza Shah tried very quickly to westernize. He built up the state, he reformed the bureaucracy within the state, created new schools and colleges, developed road and railway transportation systems, tried to create a few state monopolies in certain domestic and export-oriented markets. And additionally, he eliminated the Iranian aristocracy, of course, aside from the Shah himself, because he was the Shah. During this time, Iran also begins to exert a greater control over their oil industry. Remember that the British had dominated the oil industry in Iran since its very since the oil industry first began in Iran. Additionally, the Shah is going to succeed in pushing forth a single national identity within Persia by pushing this idea that the Iranians or the Persians are a single people whose glory actually goes back thousands of years and drawing back on the country's pre-Islamic history. Remember that we talked about the Achaemenid Empire of older times, right? This heritage, they're going to continue bragging about and being proud of. And that's their claim to how they are a powerful country from times of old. Now, Reza Shah is also going to improve the rights of women. He specifically increases the access for women to have access to education. He eliminates the requirement for women to wear head coverings in schools. He is going to what do I mean by that? He's going to restrict democratic institutions. And he is going to change the name of Persia from Persia to Iran. He is going to have a broad attack. He's part of his fight is against Shiite and Islamic influences, where he felt that they were backwards and in some instances even foreign, in the sense that Islam did come from Arab, and so he mistrusted some of the pressures put about by conservatives within Iran to follow their religion. He did not support that very strongly. He is going to, like I said, restrict democratic institutions like the press, like the Majlis. He's going to go after political and religious opponents. The power of the clergy is going to be reduced. But remember that they did not necessarily have any strong national ideology. What they did have was nationalism. He is going to make, like I said, significant progress in creating modern political institutions that are independent from the British, but he did repress civic life in Iran. Now, after World War II, the United Kingdom and the Russians, during World War II, the British and the Russians are actually going to invade Iran to control oil supplies so that they could go to Russia and prevent Iran and Iranian oil from going to Axis or German control. And he's forced, even during World War II, to leave the country in 1941. He's forced to abdicate in favor of giving the rights to governing the country to his son, Mohammad Reza. So, of course, this gets tricky because you have Reza Shah and you also have Mohammad Reza. Okay. Mohammad Reza is the son, and he is the second part of the Pahlavi dynasty. The Pahlavi dynasty is only going to have two monarchs, two Shahs, Reza Shah and Mohammad Shah. And Mohammad Shah comes into power post 1941 because the father was forced to give up his throne. Okay. And here's a picture of Reza Khan, again, also known as Reza Shah Pahlavi or Reza Shah. And here's a picture of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who is Reza Shah's son. Okay. Now, the new monarch, Mohammad Reza, is unable to slow down the Republican and religious activity in the country. Okay. The Majlis and the Ulema, who are some leaders within the, they're considered some of the clericals, some of the leadership within Iran, or religious leadership, I should say. They were trying to promote the removal of Western influence over Iran. Many of them support nationalization of the oil industry, particularly by the new prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh is a leader who comes from the political party called the National Front, which was a Republican party that favored reducing the power of the monarchy or actually eliminating it altogether. Because of this pressure, the Shah eventually reluctantly nationalizes the oil industry in 1951. Again, what nationalization means is that they take over and make it a state-run business. And this greatly pissed off the British, right? Because previously British oil companies controlled Iranian oil. And what this did was it led to the British refusing to offer technical support to Iran in the process of removing oil from Iran. And this actually leads to Iranian oil production stopped. Now, the prime minister, who was a threat to Mohammad Reza, Mohammad Mossadegh, also makes himself a closer ally with a communist party, a Marxist party that's known as the Tudeh Party. Now, they were trying to together reduce the powers of the monarchy. Mossadegh wanted greater national sovereignty in the face of Western imperialism, right? He opposed the Shah. This is going to be a precursor to the 1979 revolution, although unlike the 1979 revolution, Mossadegh wanted a secular, meaning a non-religious new government to take over. Now, the United States mistrusted Mossadegh because of Mossadegh's desire to make a government, a Republican regime that nationalized the oil industry, and also because of his alliance with the Tudeh Party. Again, remember, the Tudeh Party is a communist party. And because of this, in 1953, the United States and the United Kingdom, in an operation known as Operation Ajax, overthrew Mossadegh and continued supporting the Shah, Mohammad Reza. Now, in the immediate aftermath, there's a little bit of a power struggle, and the Shah wins that power struggle, and hundreds of National Front and Tudeh members are arrested and several of them killed. Mossadegh himself received house arrest and stayed in house arrest until his death in 1967. Now, many members of the Ulema, again, these are important Islamic scholars that are beneath Ayatollahs, welcomed Mossadegh's overthrow because they feared he would impose secularism on Iran. So again, remember, Mossadegh wanted to have a more secular government. This goes against the wishes of many members of Iran's religious class, the Ulema. The Ulema were part of domestic factors that when contributed or when added to British and American involvement, combined to overthrow Mossadegh. Now, while Reza Shah had spent a lot of his energy trying to make Iran independent of the West, Mohammad Reza tried balancing his father's quest of a more sovereign and free Iran with a new alliance with the United States. In other words, Mohammad Reza decided that it was not in Iran's best interest to have a bad relationship with the United States. He wanted to become an ally of the United States, and he did. Important to keep in mind that during the 1950s, the United States becomes the new power that has tremendous influence over Iran instead of the British. Now, Mohammad Reza is going to consolidate his power and become more powerful post-Operation Ajax. He's going to grow closer to the United States, this relationship with the United States is going to influence Iran's economy, Iran's education, their military, the culture, the civic life. However, despite being influenced by the United States, Mohammad Reza is opposed to democracy, is going to repress political parties. He's going to build a very powerful secret police force that's going to be called SAVAK. He's going to marginalize the prime minister that replaces Mossadegh, and he's going to also marginalize, push to the side, the legislature in Iran, the Majlis. As a result, Iran's short period with democracy is going to be destroyed, and this destruction is always going to be associated with the United States. Now, once Mohammad Reza consolidates power, he's going to try to continue his father's modernization efforts, and he's going to again continue marginalizing the ulema, the Islamic religious elite. In 1963, he's going to start reforms in Iran that are going to be known as the White Revolution. This modernization is going to be include the privatization of some state-run industries, meaning that some industries that previously were run by the Iranian government are going to be now run by private business. It's going to institute new land reform, literacy campaigns, and the right for women to vote, free female enfranchisement. However, some of these reforms are still going to be very strongly opposed by religious leaders. Again, this conflict between religious leaders in Iran and Mohammad Reza, who wanted to secularize Iran. Now, Ayatollah Khomeini is going to help create two protests that oppose the White Revolution. He's going to very quickly become the main person, the main symbol of opposition to the Shah, to Shah Mohammad Reza. And he's actually going to receive the title of Grand Ayatollah, which is a very prestigious title that puts him above other regular Ayatollahs. There are not many Grand Ayatollahs out there. There are some, but there are not many. Mohammad Reza, sensing the threat that Khomeini posed to his reign in power, expels Khomeini from Iran. He was feared of killing him because he thought that could lead to wide-scale revolts. And so he exiles Reza to Iraq. Eventually, also, he goes to France. But even in exile, Khomeini is going to continue criticizing the Iranian regime for corruption, inequality, and its reliance on the United States. Khomeini is going to want Iran to be governed by Islam. And he wants to serve as the leader to instill, he wants Iran to become the leader that's going to push revolutions across the Middle East. Again, remember, Iranians don't necessarily have this goal, but he himself, Khomeini, is going to have this goal. Now, for the next 15 years, Iran is going to be ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza without many serious challenges. He essentially eliminated all lies or all gimmicks to make it look like his country was democratic. He didn't care to tell the world that they were not a democracy anymore. He is going to create a very strong military, and he's going to rule through the military and SAVAK, his secret police force. He's also going to rapidly modernize the country, thanks in part through the large revenue, the oil revenue that was coming to the country. And he is going to allow Americans to work in Iran to contribute to Iran's modernization, but this is going to lead to resentment in Iran, as many Iranians felt that the Americans treated the Iranians with condescension, with hatred, in a condescending manner, in a patronizing manner. Despite their improvements under Shah Mohammad Reza, the regime's legitimacy is not strengthened in many eyes, in many Iranians, even though the middle class grew, even though there was significant progress made, because there was rampant corruption in Iran, because the Shah lived a very expensive and lavish lifestyle, because of issues with inflation, and also because of the general feeling that Iranian oil was run by the United States and other foreigners. Now, here's the problem that Mohammad Reza is going to encounter. Number one, the problem is going to be that the Iranian economy is going to get worse in the 1970s, and this is going to create an open conflict between the highly educated youth in Iran and the state. Now, there are going to be two main people that are going to criticize the Shah. The first one in 1977 is new American President Jimmy Carter, who is going to criticize the Shah for his human rights record. Because the Shah does not want to anger his American ally, and he wants to have the continued support of President Jimmy Carter in the United States, the Shah is going to try to create some very limited reforms, like releasing political prisoners and allowing the National Front to become a political party. As a result, Jimmy Carter is going to stop criticizing the Shah, which some Iranians considered a betrayal of them. The second main person to criticize the Shah is going to be Khomeini. Again, Khomeini's had a history of criticizing the Shah. And Khomeini is going to continue pushing for a new Islamic political system that's going to go against many Shiite clergy's wishes. Khomeini publishes a book called Islamic Government, the Government of the Jurist, where Khomeini argues that Islamic government should be created around the concept of Velat-e Faqih, or clerical rule, where Islamic clergy trained in jurisprudence would continue the political system first created by the Prophet Muhammad. Now, this concept of Velayat-e Faqih is going to be very important in understanding modern day Iran. Again, the definition of what this term means is rule by Islamic jurists. Okay, in the Islamic Republic's political system, this places power in the hands of the cleric. So this is going to be Velayat-e Faqih, rule by Islamic jurists, by Islamic lawyers, or by Islamic judicial scholars, who are going to be the clergy. Again, essentially, the idea that a theocracy, an Islamic theocracy, should rule Iran. In Khomeini's opinion, the clergy in Iran, okay, would serve as regents or substitute rulers in place of the Mahdi. Remember, the Mahdi, again, was the last imam who, in Shiite tradition, is going to return at the end of times to restore order and bring back God's or Allah's justice to the world. According to Khomeini, there's no problem. This is allowed because his proposed government is going to be consistent with God's will. Okay. So this is in Khomeini's opinion, this is perfectly acceptable. Now, as a result, the three main players in Iran, the Shah, Khomeini, and the United States, are going to be in a collision course around 1978. Three main events make the situation worse. In August 1978, there's a fire that breaks out in a movie theater that kills 400 people. The average Iranian blamed Savak, claiming that they were trying to make the fire seem like it was started by the Iranian clergy, when in reality, it was Iranian radicals that burned down the theater. Then in September 1978, in response to public protests, the Shah is going to create martial law, meaning that people cannot leave past a certain time, and so on and so forth. However, protests continue and intensify. Protesters demand the end of the monarchy and the return of Ayatollah Khomeini, who has been exiled, remember. During these protests, mass violence and deaths continue. And the third event is going to be that the Shah convinces the Iraqi government to exile Khomeini to France. But this didn't isolate Khomeini. If anything, this allowed him to have improved connections to Iran, the outside world, and the international media so that his message can become amplified throughout the rest of the world. The Shah unsuccessfully keeps trying to use force and co-optation, both at the same time, to eliminate his opposition or to eliminate the protests. The United States goes back and forth on whether they should support the Shah, criticizing the Shah's violence without criticizing and supporting, in fact, the Shah himself. By late 1978, the Shah loses his power and flees. The Pahlavi dynasty ends, and on February 1st, 1979, millions gathered to welcome Ayatollah Khomeini's return to Iran. And here's a picture of Ayatollah Khomeini. We had actually also seen a picture of him earlier here when we talked about why study this case, right? Now, it's important to understand, most Iranians wanted the elimination of the monarchy, but they disagreed as to what the new government that replaced the monarchy should look like. Most Iranian citizens were not trying to create an Islamic republic or an Islamic theocracy. In fact, it's unclear for us to know how many of these supporters agreed or fully even understood the type of political regime that Khomeini was trying to create. However, he was much more organized than his opponents, his political opponents, and because the situation was very difficult and challenging politically, and because he was a very charismatic leader, Khomeini is able to eliminate the secular provisional government that had replaced the Shah, and he actually takes control of the government and oversees the creation of a new constitution that allowed not only for a president, but instead of a president, a religious leader with expertise in Islamic law, a faqih, who would have supreme political authority. This is the person we now refer to as the supreme leader. So in Iran, the two executives that share power are going to be the president and not the prime minister. There's no prime minister. It's going to be the president and the supreme leader. And Khomeini is going to serve as Iran's first supreme leader from 1980 until his death in 1989. Now, once the revolution hits in 1979, they renamed the country to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Again, that's the name the country is going to have in post-revolutionary times. It is going to be created out of violence. Now, the new government's going to very quickly eliminate all opposition, including monarchists, communists, secularists, and ethnic minorities, and other people of other faiths. They're going to kill thousands. Student radical supporters of the Islamic regime are going to capture the American consulate in 1979 or 70, I believe it's 79, and they're going to hold a lot of the staff, the American staff, hostage for over a year. Now, while Khomeini didn't initially support the students, he eventually supports them, and President Carter is going to lead a very poorly executed rescue attempt of these hostages that's going to flop. And this whole crisis over the Iranian hostage crisis is going to break off diplomatic relations between both countries. And the breaking off of diplomatic relations in Iran and the United States continues to this day. Now, continuing with this immediate theme of violence in the new regime, Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq, neighboring Iraq, saw this new Iranian regime as a threat to his own country. Remember, while Shiites are not the predominant group, Shiism is not the predominant religion in the era in the Muslim world. 10 to 15% of the Muslim world practices Shiism. The rest mostly practice Sunnism. Iran and Iraq are mostly Shiite, and so Saddam Hussein sees this Shiite revolution from his neighbor in Iran, and he sees this as a threat to his own rule. Iraq and Hussein knew that Khomeini wanted to spread his revolution, and Iraq was the next logical choice for Khomeini to spread his revolution. And so Hussein also thought that he could get new lands from Iran during the chaos of the revolution. And in September of 1980, Iraq invades Iran in a war that we now call the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. Now, this war very quickly became a stalemate, with neither side being able to make significant advances despite tremendous loss of life on both sides. In 1982, Hussein actually tried ending the war and suing for peace, but Khomeini refused because he thought he could actually win the war and continue spreading his revolution across the Middle East. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Iranians and Iraqis are going to die in the war. By 1988, both countries finally realized they couldn't win the war, and they finally ended. Shortly after the end of the war, Ayatollah Khomeini dies. Now, most of the topics that we've discussed so far up to 1988 are here. We've already discussed them, right? Constitutional Revolution, 1906. Reza Khan seizes power in 1923 as prime minister. He becomes Shah in 1925 and changes his name to Reza Shah Pahlavi. Pahlavi is going to be the dynasty of Reza Khan and his son. 1941, the British and Soviets occupy Iran to secure their oil production, and Reza Shah Khan is forced to leave and exile and give the throne to his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In 1951, Parliament votes to nationalize the oil industry. In 1953, we're going to see the struggle between the Shah and Mossadegh, which culminates in Operation Ajax, where the United States and the British combine to eliminate or to overthrow Mossadegh and put him in house arrest until 1967. In 1963, the White Revolution is going to begin. In 1979, the Iranian Islamic Revolution takes place. The Shah is eliminated. Ayatollah Khomeini returns from exile. And in 1979, the US Embassy is taken over and hostages are held for 444 days. In 1980, September of 1980, Iraq invades Iran, and the war lasts for 8 years until 1988. 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini dies, and Ayatollah Khamenei becomes the new supreme leader, and he remains the supreme leader to this day. Very important to understand. Khomeini, with an O, is the first supreme leader of Iran, and he's supreme leader from 1980 to 1989. The second supreme leader's name is Khamenei, different from Khomeini in only one letter, right? Instead of an O, it's an A. And Khamenei becomes the supreme leader in 1989, and he has been supreme leader from 1989 until today. We're going to see the rest of Iranian history here. It's going to include, in the 1990s, reformers elected as president from Khatami. We talked about him a little bit earlier. We're going to see pro-reform student protests, which lead to rioting and mass arrests in 1999. We're going to see Russia helping Iran create its first nuclear reactor in 2002. In 2005, the very conservative and anti-American Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is elected president. In 2009, he wins a controversial second term. In 2013, reformist Hassan Rouhani is elected president, and in 2017, Rouhani is re-elected for a second term. We go back to Khomeini in 1980, who wants to bring about the Vilayat-e-Faqih, replacing the sovereignty of men and women with the sovereignty of God as given to the people by the clergy. But understand that this goes into conflict with the public's need or demand for a political system that responds to their needs and what was influenced by Republican, Democratic, Marxist, and liberal values. All of these were strong within Iran, and they were in conflict, perhaps, with this notion that religious leaders should govern Iran based off of what they know God's will, or what they believe they know as God's will. Now, in 1989, once Khomeini dies, one issue is going to happen. One issue is going to take place, which is known as the routinization of charisma. And this is an issue that many popular leaders have once they die. and they think they brought about a revolution, which is, how does a nation maintain the ideals of a revolution and the authority that was brought by this leader once this leader leaves, once this leader dies or is gone? And so the Constitution of Iran is a product of the 1979 revolution. The only major changes were made 10 years later when Khomeini made an effort to make sure that the principles of the Islamic Revolution, the Islamic Republic, would continue even after he died. The preamble, or the beginning, of the Iranian Constitution describes the revolution as a revolt against the American conspiracy of the White Revolution. Remember, the White Revolution of 1963, instituted by Shah Mohammed, was trying to modernize and open up the country. But this was against the wishes of the clerics, of the religious ulema, of many religious ulema, of many religious leaders in Iran. And so, according to the Constitution, this was an American conspiracy. Additionally, according to the Constitution, the Islamic Republic serves to guide people towards God, not to serve the individual. So serving the individual is not the purpose of the government. In fact, the purpose of the government is to help people get closer to God. All political acts are expected to go from the Word of God. As the Constitution states, all civil, penal, financial, economic, and administrative, cultural, military, political, and other laws and regulations must be based off of Islamic criteria. Again, this language is textbook religious fundamentalism. Now, in Islam, God's law is known as Sharia law. That's the term that we give to the notion of what God's law is. According to religious fundamentalists in the Islamic world, according to religious fundamentalists in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Sharia law reigns supreme. Now, because the revolution primarily was led by ordinary people that were not Khomeini, who was on the outside, or the ulema, who were not outnumbering the vast majority of people, the Iranian Revolution is also going to reflect how the overthrow of the Shah occurred by the people. And as a result, the Iranian Constitution is also going to have a strong Republican element, even if it's not entirely very democratic. And so there's going to be this tension between republicanism and theocracy, even present within the Constitution, that remains present in Iran to this day. And it's going to be, in some instances, there's going to be some semblances of democratic rule. And in other instances, we're going to see that the theocracy is much more powerful than the democratic institutions that Iran does have. Okay. So the essential features of the Iranian system, it's going to be a semi-presidential theocracy, very unique in the world. The legislature is going to be called the Majlis. There is really, it's a unicameral legislature, so there is no bicameral legislature. There's no two houses. There's just one house, and we're going to call that the Majlis. In Iran, we're going to call the division of power unitary, meaning that there isn't a shared distribution of power between the state and regional governments. It's a very strong unitary government. However, the main geographic subunits in Iran, we're going to call them ostans. They're basically provinces. The electoral system for the lower house in Iran is going to be single-member and multi-member districts with plurality. So they're going to have both single-member districts, and they're also going to have multi-member districts. The chief judicial body in Iran is going to be called the Supreme Court. Now, I posted two diagrams outside of the book in an effort to try to show the very complicated relationship between the various institutions in Iran. Okay, and you can see that some of them are elected and some of them are not elected. Now, let's try to go through them. Okay. In theory, the Assembly of Experts, which is a group of, I believe, 86 religious experts, are going to vote, and they're going to elect the supreme leader. And the supreme leader is going to rule for life. Okay. Now, the supreme leader is going to appoint the members of the armed forces, the leadership of the armed forces, the head of the judiciary, which we're going to call a chief justice, and that chief justice is going to oversee the Supreme Court, and the supreme leader is going to deal with the expediency council. Now, the head of the judiciary and the supreme leader both are going to, along with parliament, create the guardian council. And the guardian council is going to have several powers. The biggest power that they're going to have, and the most important power they're going to have, is they're going to be able to check out and vet the candidates running for president, running for parliament, running for the assembly of experts, and they're going to be able to remove leaders that are not compatible with the tenets of the Iranian Revolution. Now, the voters, once they get their restricted list of people that they can vote for, they're going to have the power to vote for president, parliament, the Majlis, and the assembly of experts. The president and the parliament combined are going to have power to select the cabinet, and the parliament is going to have the power, along with the head of the supreme, the chief justice, and along with the supreme leader, they're going to have the power of selecting the guardian council. Okay. Yeah, this gets very tricky, and this also shows it in a little bit of a different manner. I recommend that you look at these links that I've posted. They may help explain some of these concepts. I'll try doing my best to explain them over the next several slides, but if you're still confused, I recommend that you read the information found in the textbook, or that you read the information found in this BBC slide and this article from the Council on Foreign Relations, because I think they can be very helpful in understanding these concepts. Now, let's talk first about the executive branch in Iran. It's a dual executive where power is divided into two offices: the supreme leader, who is the dominant executive, and the president, who is going to be the head of government. Okay. In other countries, the monarch or the president reigns as the head of state, while the prime minister rules as the head of government. In Iran, the president is the head of government, and the supreme leader is a very powerful executive that has way more power than the president. Okay. Normally, head of states are not very powerful. Now, the supreme leader serves for life, although in theory they can be removed for incompetence or failure to uphold religious duty. And the supreme leader has the ability to make sure that a senior cleric, a man, is at the helm, is in charge of Iranian politics by leading both political and spiritual life within Iran. We can see the supreme leader as both a head of state that represents the people and guides them religiously. But again, this role is a lot more powerful than a traditional head of state. We may almost see them essentially as a traditional monarch. Since 1989, the supreme leader has been Khomeini, who previously served as president of Iran from 1981 to 1989. Now, Khomeini was not previously a grand ayatollah or even an ayatollah, but he was made an ayatollah before he was made the supreme leader, because the constitution of Iran requires that the supreme leader of Iran be an ayatollah. At the time that Khomeini got power, he was assumed as unthreatening, as a peaceful choice for all sides. However, since he's gotten power, he has solidified his power to himself by making himself an ally with the Iranian ulema and also Iran's military leadership. On the other hand, aside from the supreme leader, we have the president, and the president is directly elected and may only serve 2 4-year terms, so a total of 8 years. Now, the supreme leader is selected by the Assembly of Experts, a body of 88. I think I said 86 before. It's a body of 88 members. All of them are men, and all of them are Islamic scholars who themselves are popularly elected by the people for 8-year terms. So in theory, the body may also remove the supreme leader for the reasons we said earlier, where the supreme leader is not faithful to the Islamic religion. But that has never really happened. And candidates for the Assembly of Experts are vetted. Vetted means they are approved and checked out. by a group called the Guardian Council in advance of elections. So I think I had shown you guys here how the Guardian Council vets and makes sure that candidates for president, parliament, and the assembly of experts are fine. Now, because there's only been one transfer of power between supreme leaders, in other words, because the only time we have seen supreme leadership change hands from Khomeini to Khamenei, Khamenei, that's only happened one time in Iran, it's hard to really have an idea of how big of a role the Assembly of Experts will have in Iran once Khamenei dies. Now, after 1979, the thought was that the Iranian president was not going to be a religious figure. There was not going to be a need for a religious figure, considering how the supreme leader must always be a religious figure. In practice, however, from 1981 until 2005, the presidential position was essentially held by clerics. However, in 2005, President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's election changed things. He was not from the religious class. In fact, he was somebody who had been the mayor of Tehran, and before that, he had been a leader in higher education, and he did not have a religious title. Ahmadinejad grew his base of support within Iran by emphasizing issues like promoting social justice, like pushing for religious piety, which is religious adherence to the religious beliefs of Shiism. And he also based his support off of confronting the West over the country's nuclear program. This base of support is the fact he was so well liked by many people, particularly in the immediate aftermath of his elections, seemed to rival the support of Khamenei. And so the question is going to be, why would Khamenei rig the election, or why would Iran rig the election in favor of Ahmadinejad winning re-election? And that's because they didn't want reformers coming back into Iran. However, once Ahmadinejad wins re-election, the supreme leader really controls or tightens the controls that he has over Ahmadinejad, so that Ahmadinejad doesn't do as much as he was able to do in his first term. In 2013, the next election, President Hassan Rouhani, a cleric, pushed for a more reformist and less confrontational agenda. And this allowed him to pass in 2015 an agreement with Western countries over Iran's nuclear ambitions, where Iran essentially promised to not enrich nuclear materials to the point where they could get nuclear missiles in exchange for certain security guarantees and money. Again, the United States is going to withdraw from this agreement, and the agreement is going to collapse within the Trump administration because President Trump thought the deal was very weak and was not being enforced within Iran, that Iran was still cheating the deal. But in 2017, President Hassan Rouhani is going to be reelected. And even though he wants to seemingly liberalize the political and domestic institutions in Iran, his efforts at this fail. So I like this because I was able to divide the powers of the Iranian supreme leader and the Iranian president. The Iranian supreme leader's powers include serving as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He's able to appoint the heads of the various military branches. He wields control over the Guardian Council, which in turn has control over who may run for office at the presidential and legislative elections. The supreme leader is also going to appoint the chief justice, and the chief justice is going to appoint the Supreme Court. So by having power over the chief justice, the supreme leader has tremendous power over the judicial system in Iran. And last but not least, the supreme leader is going to control significant state-owned economic assets that are not subject to control by any other government branches. On the other hand, the president is going to have some powers. He has the ability to draft the state budget. He also can start legislation. He's not the only one. The Majlis may also start legislation, but the president has the power to start legislation. He has the power of selecting cabinet members that are going to be charged with implementing government policy. He's going to make sure that he's going to execute the country's laws and make sure that the specific policies are carried out. And technically, he's in charge of foreign power and foreign policy by appointing ambassadors, signing treaties, and helping create diplomatic relations. But given that he doesn't control the military and the supreme leader controls the military, the truth is that while he's technically in charge of the foreign policy, in practice, the supreme leader has tremendous control over the boundaries of what is acceptable foreign policy in Iran. It's important to know that the president does not have the power to veto legislation. The president does not have the power to dissolve the legislature, and the president cannot call for elections. These are very common within parliamentary countries, parliamentary democracies. Now we go to the Majlis, which is the legislature. It's the political institution that continues from Iran's pre-revolutionary past. It's a unicameral body, meaning it's only one body. It's not divided into two houses, that has 290 members that each serve for a 4-year term, and they must at least be 30 years old. Any man or woman in Iran over the age of 18 may vote for the Majlis. Now, again, just like the prior Majlis before the revolution, this current iteration of the Majlis have very limited power. Okay. While in the early years of the revolution, the Majlis were dominated by the clerics, recently the clerics have not been as involved within the Majlis, and instead members of the Majlis are associated with the paramilitary group known as Revolutionary Guard, which has increased its presence in the Majlis. Now, the Majlis does have certain seats that are set aside for believers in Zoroastrianism, in Zoroastrian faith. So they have one spot reserved for Zoroastrianism, I believe. And they have one spot, I believe, reserved for the Jews, one spot reserved for Assyrian and Chaldean Christians, and one spot reserved for Armenian Christians. I think in total, they have 3 seats out of the 290 reserved for Christians. Additionally, in 2016, out of all the candidates that were nominated and that ran for office, that were allowed to run for office, the elections came back with 16 women serving in the Majlis. Okay. Here you see in this what looks like this orange, like very orangey color, not darker orange or burnt orange. Burnt orange shows the women that are in Iran, but in this lighter orange, you see how many clerics are in the Majlis, and then you see the rest are other. Many of them are going to be members of Iran's paramilitary group known as the Revolutionary Guard. Now, the Majlis has the power of starting and passing legislation. The Majlis has the power of overseeing the budget, of approving the president's nominees for his cabinet. The Majlis may also remove members of the cabinet by a vote of no confidence. However, they cannot remove the president or the supreme leader. Now, technically, the Majlis' obligation is to pass laws in accordance to Sharia law. And technically, if they pass laws that go against Sharia law, it may be struck down. We're going to see how in a second. The Majlis cannot challenge the supreme leader, but conflicts between the Majlis and the president over national policy, specifically within the budget, are common. And they do have, they do argue among each other so that they can try to produce money to go to their local areas, which is commonly seen throughout the rest of the world. That is something that is seen in the Majlis. We call that pork barreling. Now, the broader limitations of the Majlis are going to be seen in the existence of 2 additional bodies, what are known as the Guardian Council and the Expediency Council. Both of these groups are going to have the ability to restrict laws passed by the Majlis. The Guardian Council is made up of 12 people who serve 6-year terms. And the Chief Justice, remember the Chief Justice is appointed by the Supreme Leader. The Chief Justice appoints 6 lawyers, experts in Sharia law, that are then approved by the Majlis. And they appoint 6 of the members of the Guardian Council, and then the Supreme Leader appoints 6 religious leaders that specialize in religious law. and they're going to be the other 6 members of the 12-person Guardian Council. Now, the Guardian Council has very strong powers. They get to review all laws that come out of the Majlis to make sure that these laws are compatible with the requirements of Islam and the Iranian constitution. And so any law that fails to comply with their understanding of what's required within Islam gets pushed back to the Majlis. And if the Majlis are unable to fix the laws to the likings of the Guardian Council, then there is a third body that mediates and fixes the disagreement between the Majlis and the Guardian Council. That's called the Expediency Council. Now, the Expediency Council is appointed by the Supreme Leader for 5-year terms, and it was headed by Rafsanjani, who was a long-standing rival to Khomeini and served as president from 1989 to 1997. But a final decision made by the Expediency Council may not be overturned. So if we think about it, the Guardian Council, and to a lesser extent, the Expediency Council, almost serve as an unelected upper house that has substantial powers to restrict the work of the Majlis. That's why, if you noticed, the textbook said that there was a lower house, the Majlis, but they didn't say there was an upper house because it's technically not an upper house. But the Majlis is definitely in an inferior position when it comes to passing laws, because the Guardian Council, and if not the Guardian Council, the Expediency Council, have the power to veto laws passed by the Majlis that are incompatible with Islamic law. Okay. Now, the judiciary, right? So the legal system in Iran, as I told you, is called Sharia law. It's essentially God's law as understood by Islam. In Sharia law, this concept of rule of law, where nobody is above the law and everybody is secondary or subject to the law, does not exist. In Sharia law, this is seen as an attempt by human beings to assume the legal authority that only God has. Right? Only God has the power to really pass laws that govern people. And so they don't like the rule of law. And so since 1979, Iran's legal system has been changed to conform with the understanding of following Islamic ideology in general. So let's discuss their court system. The Chief Justice is at the very top of the judiciary, and he's appointed to a 5-year term by the Supreme Leader. He oversees judicial institutions and manages them. He oversees the appointment and removal of judicial officers. Directly below the Chief Justice is the Supreme Court, which serves as Iran's highest court of appeal. Now, this office, like the Chief Justice position, is staffed by high-ranking clerics who are picked because of how familiar they are with Islamic religious law. Now, at the lower level courts, there's going to be a lot of clerics. And again, only clerics and only men, because only men can be clerics, may serve as judges. Now, in Iran, judges do have a large degree of independence when it comes to interpreting law, which frequently leads to contradictory opinions across the courts. Because of this, some people feel that Iran's court system is the most dysfunctional set of institutions in the country. Now, aside from civil and criminal courts, Iran also has what are known as revolutionary courts, and these courts deal with issues involving national security. They try and sentence individuals on the grounds of Moharabeh, which is rebellion against God. Iran executes the second highest number of individuals in the world after China. And of course, you got to remember that Iran's population is only 80 million, whereas China's population is what, 1.3 billion? And in 2018, for example, Iran executed 200 people. By comparison, the United States, which has a population of almost 4 times, or more than 4 times the size of Iran, only executed 25 people. Now, the people who were killed were murderers and drug smugglers. Now, despite how limited democracy is in Iran because of the theocratic institutions in the country, there is some elements of democratic participation in Iran. So, for example, the Iranian public has direct election over who gets to be selected or who gets to become a Majli, who gets to be in the Assembly of Experts, and who gets to be president. In 2017, over 70% of eligible voters voted in the election, which is pretty high. Most of the public considers elections very seriously, especially if they believe that they have a legitimate shot at actually putting people in power who are going to be able to create change. However, the average Iranian is going to be very highly restricted in who they can vote for, because the Guardian Council is going to have the power of restricting all elections and who gets to run for an election, right? This essentially means that that this unelected Guardian Council has the power to reject any candidate who's running for office. And they've rejected hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the last few elections, including in 2017, President Ahmadinejad's bid to run for election. The Guardian Council's power to block candidates or even remove current representatives from running for re-election consolidates the power in Iran to the conservatives. They have the conservatives in Iran, the religious conservatives in Iran, have power over the Majlis, over the president. However, President Rouhani's election, along with the election of the most recent Majli, all of whom were, or many of whom were strong reformers, show that supporters of reform may still be elected to some positions of power in Iran. It just so happens that these positions of power are pretty weak. The Majlis in Iran are elected using a combination of single-member and multi-member districts. We talked about this already. In the single-member districts, the candidate with the largest share of the votes wins, as long as their vote was more than 25%. If no single candidate got 25%, then the top two candidates have a runoff, and whoever gets the highest vote wins. In the multi-member districts with more than one seat, voters vote for each seat with similar runoffs if they are needed. Now, the Assembly of Experts use a single-member district system with a runoff, right? Remember that the people can vote for the Assembly of Experts. It's a single-member district with without a runoff, and the candidate with the largest number of votes wins. For the presidency, there is a two-round runoff if none of the candidates can get a majority of the votes in the first round. Rouhani did get the majority of the votes in 2013 and 2017. In 2009, if you remember, Ahmadinejad got 60% of the vote in a controversial election where people thought that there was going to be a runoff, but there was no runoff. Now, in terms of local government, Iran is divided into 31 ostans. Ostans is the unit for them for provinces. It's their version of little states of regional areas. Ostans have very limited authority, which is true even in pre-revolutionary Iran. Remember that the Iranian regime has historically centralized its power. Iran does not like devolution. In 1997, however, reformists passed a law supporting some decentralization that took power away from the Ministry of the Interior. Prior to 1997, for example, the ministry was always responsible for all local affairs, like appointing regional governors and mayors. With the passage of the new law, local councils were created at the village, city, district, and provincial levels to handle local politics, and they were able to have many people be voted for. Now, again, local candidates must be approved by the Majlis. Now, while the Majlis does not discriminate as badly as the Guardian Council's review, it still is a barrier to having candidates run for office, because at the end of the day, the Majlis must approve the local candidates running for office. Aside from these institutions, there are other institutions within Iran that are very important. Two of them are military, are associated with the military. The first one is the Revolutionary Guard, which is known as the Pasdaran. I'm going to refer to it as the Revolutionary Guard. That's what everybody calls it. And these are paramilitary forces that came out of the 1979 revolution. Now, initially, the Revolutionary Guard was several thousand men that came from various militias and groups during the revolution and were independent of the armed forces. Khomeini did not like the armed forces because the armed forces in the 1970s supported the Pahlavi dynasty. Now, the Revolutionary Guard initially had the task of defending the new regime and eliminating all rival groups and movements like Marxists and supporters for greater ethnic autonomy. Today, the Revolutionary Guard has its own ministry, army, navy, and air force units. And they also have a role, and we don't know exactly how big of a role, but they have some role in the development of Iran's nuclear program, rather. The Revolutionary Guard actively supports, through training and troops, conflicts in Iran and Syria going against the United States. The Revolutionary Guard is known for having acts of terrorism at home. They're heavily involved in the Iranian economy. But the Revolutionary Guard leadership is highly factionalized. They compete for support among each other to see who the supreme leader likes most. The Revolutionary Guard is an increasingly independent player in Iranian domestic and international affairs, considering how members have taken the important roles in the state and in state and general. They have significant economic assets in Iran, even though President Rouhani has attempted to limit the economic power of the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard to this day is viewed as a public morality police. We're going to see how that's pretty bad for the average Iranian. The second known group in Iran is the Basij. The Basij is the people's militia that's going to come out as a large volunteer militia that was very poorly trained and very ill-equipped, but they were very passionately religious and nationalist. They actually just sent massive human wave attacks against Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. Okay. Now, the Basij today is no longer a significant military force, but they do have substantial economic assets today. They are involved as, I'm sorry, it wasn't the Revolutionary Guard. The Basij is involved as a public morality force. They prevent, for example, PDA, like hand-holding and kissing in Iran, and they take illegal satellite dishes down. And they were also used in 2009 to break up the protests of what took place in once Ahmadinejad was reelected in that controversial election. Now, while the end of the Iran-Iraq war and the consolidation of the revolution in some ways eliminated a lot of the reason for both of these groups to exist, they continue to play an influential role today in Iranian politics, and they are very strongly controlled by the supreme leader and his allies. They are very loyal to the supreme leader and the supreme leader's allies. Now, political competition in Iran is very hard to understand. They don't necessarily, it's hard for us to understand or to just put Iran into normal ideology. Iran does not have political parties or even a single party system, unlike, for example, in China, where there's a communist party, or in Russia, where there are make-believe parties that are just essentially there to seemingly give the appearance of a Russian democracy. Iran doesn't have political parties. Iranian politics are frequently factionalized and clientelist. They're dominated loosely by political and economic groups that are struggling for power that at any moment may seem similar to what you'd see in a democratic system, but in reality are just political struggles between elites that are all controlled by, or many of whom are controlled by, the clerics in Iran. After 1979, some of the political groups reemerged, like the National Front and like the Marxist Tudeh Party. Right after that, there were two other groups that came out: the Islamic Republic Party, that was allied with Khomeini, and the Liberation Movement, that was more pro-Western and secular. The Liberation Movement tried to resist the consolidation of the power into the supreme leader, but these efforts failed. In 1984, only the IRP continued as a party, and by 1987, even the IRP was eliminated, so that no political party may exist in Iran. After 1987, the Majlis primarily are going to only argue economic issues. Okay, so you're going to see that within the Majlis, some political competition occurs between those who want the government to have a stronger role in the economy and those who want to liberalize the economy and support free market systems. You're going to see that with the death of Khomeini in 1989 and with a bad economy in 1992, the elections for Majlis in 1992 saw a victory for those that support free market positions. So in 1990s, we see a reform within the Majlis to push for an increase in some political views and organizations. And many people within the Majlis wanted to see Iran improve its foreign relations, have democratic change, and improve the rights for women that were significantly reduced in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. These arguments come from the intellectual educated class, from students, and even from some religious leaders who oppose the Vilayat-e-Faqih. In 2000, reform groups merged to form the Second Khordad Front, which is a reformist alliance that emerged in Iran to argue the 2000 Majlis election, the 1999 election. And they were trying to compete in elections for the 2001 year. This group wins about 189 out of 290 parliamentary seats. Khatami was overwhelmingly elected. No, this is in 2000, not 1999, I'm sorry. Khatami was also overwhelmingly elected with over 70% of the votes. People thought that this was going to transition, that Iran might go through a similar transition as the USSR. But the problem is that the reformers only controlled the weak institutions, like the Majlis, like the presidency. Conservatives still control the powerful institutions of the Guardian Council and the Expediency Council. They control the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij, and of course, the supreme leader himself is a conservative. So shortly after the 2001 election, repression comes against the reformists. Journalists and pro-democracy activists are arrested and killed, and pro-reform newspapers are shut down. Reform bills from the Majlis to limit state power and increase democratic rights are vetoed by the Guardian Council. In 2004, the Guardian Council bans large numbers of Khordad candidates in the Majlis election, including 80 members of parliament. They were not allowed to run for re-election. Reformers call for a boycott. In 2016, reformers returned to the Majlis on the heels of President Rouhani's election, but their impact has been limited. Now, when Khatami steps down in 2005, many people thought that his friend and former president, Rafsanjani, was going to return to power as another pro-reform candidate, but instead, the mayor of Tehran, who I've already discussed, Ahmadinejad, becomes president. Ahmadinejad has support from the poor and the more conservative elements of the country. Additionally, Ahmadinejad has ties to the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij. Three main trends emerged during the 8 years where Ahmadinejad is in power. Number one, he has a populist approach to politics. These were similar to the values seen in the early years of the Islamic Republic. Ahmadinejad favors public programs that help the poor. And this is a threat to government and clerical elites that have become rich through their roles in government. This becomes a threat to those who are corrupt. So Ahmadinejad, number one, he's a populist in politics. Number two, he pushes for a much more confrontational relationship with the United States. He makes life a lot more difficult in the United States and Afghanistan and Iraq, and he frequently destroys verbally the United States publicly. Last but not least, the third trend in Ahmadinejad's terms in power, Ahmadinejad supports nuclear technology in Iran, even though Ahmadinejad has no say, no power in whether Iran gets nuclear technology or not. Now, Ahmadinejad's rising profile makes him a threat, like I said earlier, to the supreme leader. And in 2009, a former prime minister of Iran from 1981 to 1989, Hossein Mousavi, who had long been out of power, pushes for a pro-reform agenda, a liberalized press, greater rights for women, more power for the Majlis. He receives large support, and many people thought that there was going to be what was called a green wave supporting him for reform. It was thought for sure he'd get a runoff election against Ahmadinejad, but Ahmadinejad wins 60% of the vote and eliminates the need for a second runoff election. This creates mass demonstrations questioning whether the outcome of the election was rigged, and the police and the Basij respond ferociously by arresting and killing protesters. Mousavi himself went into house arrest, where he continues to this day. In 2013, the election shows that while many people thought that a close friend of the supreme leader would become president, Instead, the person that becomes president is Hassan Rouhani. And Rouhani won because, number one, he ran a very good, strong, aggressive campaign supporting things like the release of Mousavi and siding with the Green Wave. Number two, Rouhani offered practical critiques of Iranian politics. For example, he criticized the sanctions that were a product of Ahmadinejad's pursuit of nuclear technology. He criticized the erratic economic policies of Ahmadinejad. And the third reason that he wins, he had prior experience as a negotiator on the nuclear issue, which made Iranians think that he could cut a deal with the West, and by cutting a deal with the West, improve the day-to-day living conditions in Iran. However, unfortunately, Rouhani has not been as successful as people hoped, and reformists continue being jailed in Iran today. We've talked about this a lot already. Iran is different from Middle Eastern countries when we're talking about ethnic and national identity, because it has the Shiite branch of Islam as opposed to the Sunni. And secondly, because the population is mostly Iranian or Persian, if we're being more correct, instead of Arab. Iran has a very strong sense of nationalism, which is stronger than many other countries in the Middle East. This strong sense of nationalism helped them in their war with Iraq and the Iran-Iraq war. And even as the legitimacy of the Islamic regime might be going down, Iranian nationalism built on the myths of the pre-Islamic era, particularly the Achaemenid Empire, have resurfaced, right? They're drawing on the history of the Achaemenid Empire and Zoroastrianism, the pre-Islamic religion. It's important to remember, though, that while it's very strongly nationalist, Iran is not necessarily a homogeneous state with only one ethnicity. Even though Persians make up its majority population of 60%, there are other groups in Iran. I showed you guys how the Azeris are 16% of the population, and even though at different times they have wanted more independence, for the most part to this day right now, they don't really seek greater regional autonomy. Azeris formed their own country post-Soviet Union that's called Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan has a very difficult or very bad relationship with Iran. Azerbaijan and Iran do not like each other. Here's Azerbaijan. Here are the Azeris in Iran. Okay, so the Azerbaijan has a bad relationship with Iran, but the Azeris here don't really want more control of the government. Not for the most part. This may change in the future, but right now they don't. The other group in Iran, the other main group in Iran, are the Kurds. The Kurds are 10% of the population, and they did fight against the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979, and they controlled some parts of northwestern Iran. Remember, Kurds are also located in Turkey and Iraq. And generally, the Kurds from all three of these countries, they do want their own country, and this scares Iran. Of course, it also scares Turkey and Iraq. Okay. And then there are other groups in Iran, like the Baluchis near Pakistan or the Arabs near the Persian Gulf, who complain of discrimination, but they really don't have any power to do much about it. They have very limited opportunities for education or media given to them in their own native language. Discrimination occurs even more strongly on the religious grounds, as Sunnis have very few high opportunities for government positions. Here's the breakdown from a percentage standpoint of Iran's ethnicities. There's a group called the Lur that for some reason are not really shown a lot in maps, in the map that I showed you, and they're bigger than the Baluchi. And the Lur have 6% of the population, ethnic-wise. Arabs are about 2%, Baluchis are about 2%, Persian 61, Azeri 16, Kurd 10. In terms of religion, officially 99.4% of the country is Islam. Okay. About 90 to 95% of them are supposed to be Shiites out of this 99.4, with 5 to 10% being Sunni. And then you have a very small percentage, 0.3% of the population is Zoroastrian, Jewish, and Christian. Like I've said, very hard to put any political ideology, describe it when we're talking about Iran. At the end of the day, political relationships and being related to the clergy is much more powerful than any political idea you may have in Iran. But there are some ways that we can divide Iran politically, there's two main ways. Number one, differences in the role of religion. So those that support reforming Iran, reducing the presence of Islam in politics in favor of a secular or more secular rule of law and democratic reform, those are the people who are going to be against the notion of Vilayat Faqih as being contrary to Shiite religion. They're going to be called as quietists, okay? They don't believe that a worldly political power can reunite with Islam until the return of the Mahdi. So quietists are reformists in Iran that want a reduction of power from the theocratic regime to whatever extent they want, and support Iran becoming a more secular country. Principalists are the terms that we're going to give to Iranian political conservatives who oppose liberalization and political reform. They're going to support the Vilayat Faqih. Faith is an important institution within the state, and the principalists are strongly supported by the Revolutionary Guard, and this support makes prospects for change in Iran when it comes to eliminating the theocracy very unlikely. Now, it's true, both quietists and principalists have support among high-ranking ayatollahs who operate independently of the supreme leader as long as they do not openly challenge the legitimacy of the regime. So we're going to see that the first way that we can maybe describe the political differences between the major groups in Iran is in the presence, or how much presence the government should have, the religion should have in the government, the Islamic religion should have in government. Those that are in favor of reducing religion in Iran are going to be called quietists. They believe that they're correctly interpreting Shiite religion when they say that no worldly political power can reunite Islam until the return of the Mahdi. And then you're also going to have the second group when it comes to the religious argument, who are going to be on the opposite side, the principalists, conservatives who support the religious theocracy in Iran and do not want to see a reduction of the Islamic regime in Iran. The second way that we can divide politics in Iran is the differences in opinion over the relationship between state and market. This is going to be something more familiar for people who follow American politics. Some people believe economic liberalization is better, and they want to improve relationships with the economic community, international community, to increase trade and investment within Iran. Others, like the supreme leader and many principalists, are much more skeptical that economic reform and liberalization can occur, particularly if it's tied with support, improved relationships within the United States. It's important to keep in mind that support for or hostility to capitalism is not necessarily neatly divided between principalists and quietists. In other words, a principalist might possibly be in favor of more market reforms. A quietist might be potentially more in favor of more state control over the economy. So it's not necessarily always going to be true that principalists are going to be in favor of state control over the economy, and quietists are going to be in favor of liberalization of the economy. This is a pretty interesting poll that shows how many adults believe that religious figures should have some say in political issues in Iran. 40% believe that Iranian religious figures should have a strong say in political matters. 26% say they should have some influence in political matters. 19%, not too much. 11%, no influence. 4%, no, did not answer. I would question how accurate these polls are, given how scared people might be in speaking against religious leadership in Iran. Now, aside from economic and religious debates, like I said earlier, Iran remains very strongly nationalist religion and simultaneously more supportive for a stronger democracy. Remember that it's a good chance that the correct interpretation of what Shiite religion teaches is the quietist view in favor of a greater separation between faith and state. It's also important to remember that Iran has a very complicated relationship with the West. In some ways, Iran views Persia, Greece, and Rome as all being equals, and they all contributed to Western civilization. However, Iranian history, because it has been so frequently invaded by Western and Arabs, have made Iran or Persians see the world in very conspiratorial terms. They always think everybody's out to get them. For example, Iranians will blame the United Kingdom and the United States for the rise of the Pahlavi dynasty, while simultaneously also blaming the West for the 1979 revolution that brings down the Pahlavi dynasty. I always find that interesting that they blame the West for the 1979 Islamic Revolution, given how much the Islamic Revolution has continued to this day, and it's the current regime, and given how much the leadership of the Islamic Revolution, the principalists, the conservatives of the 1979 revolution are very strongly anti-West. But it is what it is. Some people will blame the West for this revolution. For many, the United States and Israel are the masterminds behind Al-Qaeda, 9/11, and or ISIS. And some people, and I found this fascinating, some people actually think that the United Kingdom controls the United States, and that the United States is nothing more than a puppet for the United Kingdom. In fact, Khomeini blamed the United Kingdom and not the United States for the 2009 protests that took place. I thought that was fascinating. It's important to remember that Iran's economic system has been impacted by late modernization, authoritarianism, and war. Iran started off as being very mercantilistic, and their mercantilistic policies modernized the country so that by 1970s, half of the population lived in urban or city areas. The country did make a rapid jump from farming or agrarian, being isolated and being very religiously conservative up until the 1970s. Today, however, Iran is seen as an example of a resource force because while we can think of oil maybe as a positive thing, in many of these countries, oil is more of a curse than a blessing, particularly when oil is controlled by the state. Why? Well, because leaders, instead of sending the revenue that comes from oil towards developing the country and developing different sectors of the economy, steal wealth from their sales of oil to become rich or to serve their own policy preferences. And because the public does not have major wealth, those in power can literally ignore the public and repress or co-opt or basically buy off any opposition. Where oil is strong, women's rights are weak because the private sector is weak. And women do not participate in the workforce or gain economic independence. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the Revolutionary Constitution of 1979 says that the economy is a means, not an end. So it's a means to serving God's will, not an end in and of itself. Meaning that if people are poor, well, that may not be the end result. That may not be the end result that the government cares for. Oil and other state-owned industries remain in the state's hands. Profit and wealth are corrupting influences according to the Constitution. So profit's not a good thing, neither is wealth. There are parastatal foundations named bonyads that are made from assets that were taken from the Iranian Revolution that theoretically were designed to help those who are disadvantaged, like war veterans, like the poor. But they have become controlled by the political elite in Iran for their own purposes, including the Revolutionary Guard. In Iran, the private sector is very small and it's dominated by small-scale businesses. This is especially true when you compare how big oil industry, the bonyads, and state-owned businesses are. Iran's economic history has a tendency for what's known as autarky or economic independence. If you remember, the opponents of the Qajar and Pahlavi dynasties claim that the Iranian leadership or the Iranian shahs of those dynasties sold off Iran, sold off Persia to foreigners, particularly the British, the Americans, the Russians. As a result, the post-revolutionary government doesn't really care about having strong economic ties with the rest of the world, right? It is true that in the 1990s, some Iranian political leaders did want to increase foreign direct investment to Iran, but American-led sanctions killed those prospects, and sanctions, of course, came into place because of terrorism activity from the Revolutionary Guard and because of Iran's pursuit of nuclear material. Conservatives, particularly the Supreme Leader, continue to emphasize what's called a, quote, resistance economy that is independent of international trade and investment, and this has been similarly used to justify Iran's nuclear program. It's important to understand the effect that the Iran-Iraq war had on the economy. It devastated. And to this day, Iran's economy hasn't fully recovered. For example, today's oil production in Iran is half of the level of where it stood in 1979. And what really destroyed it was the Iran-Iraq War. Iran has struggled with high inflation that have hurt pension plans and savings for the average Iranian. The unemployment rates in Iran are interesting to know. Official unemployment is 12%. The Iranian youth have a very high rate of unemployment, 30% for those who are under 24 are unemployed. And of course, women and those with high education have really high unemployment rates. This is very important to know. When you have a population that's very highly educated, or a segment of your population that's highly uneducated and also unemployed, what that shows is the country's lack of opportunities for educated people to find work in private industry. And what normally happens when highly educated people in a country don't have opportunities to find work is that these groups either try to find their own illegal economic activity within the country, right, through the informal economy. They don't pay taxes and they don't report their businesses to the Iranian government. Or these educated individuals not having jobs, not having job security, flee the country in something that's called brain drain. Brain drain is a term that's used to discuss what happens when people, the smartly educated people in the country, flee to another country, draining that country of brains, of intelligent people, because of lack of opportunity or because of lack of security in the home country. And Iran has suffered from brain drain. People who have remained, particularly among the educated, are delaying marriages, and this has contributed to some of the lowest birth rates in the region. So even though Iran's population is pretty young, Iran nowadays has a very low birth rate, and I think that's going to make the population older as time passes. I said this earlier that like Russia, like the Russian Revolution, like the Chinese Revolution, Iran's revolutionary leader thought that their revolution would be the first in a series of revolutions that would sweep the Islamic world. Initially, Muslims saw the Iranian Revolution as a beacon for their grievances, their problems. The Iranian Revolution gave voice to their problems against the West and against their own evil rulers. It did not really succeed for a couple of reasons. Number one, Shiism itself. Remember, most Muslims are not Shiites, and so they view the Iranian Shiite revolution as not being good, because it goes against the Sunni religion. The Shiites go against the Sunni religion. And so only Bahrain, Iraq, Lebanon, Afghanistan have significant numbers of Shiites. In fact, some people within the Muslim community believe that Shiites are, or the Shiite interpretation of Islam, is even worse than Judaism or Christianity. The other reason that Iran's vision of exporting political Islam to the rest of the world didn't succeed is because ethnicity. Remember that Iranians are not Arabs, and Arabs are the majority group within the Middle East. Arabs did not agree with the Iranian attempt to overthrow secular leaders. In most Arab countries, they continue having a monarchy led by a Sunni king, including Saudi Arabia. Arabs did not agree with establishing Islamic states. Arabs did not agree with driving out Western influence in process. It's also important to keep in mind that Iran has strongly become associated with terrorism, particularly through its support of the Shiite group Hezbollah, which is a party of God, and Lebanon. So the Revolutionary Guard supports Hezbollah and has killed hundreds of people in suicide attacks against American and French forces in the past, and including to this present, they continue carrying out a lot of killings. Hezbollah kills and attacks Israeli occupying forces in the region. And Iran has also sponsored other Palestinian groups like Hamas, like the Islamic Jihad, all of whom run against the American, desires of Western interests and make them terrorist groups. Now, Iran has gone back and forth between trying to make peace with the West and also making things worse with the West throughout the last 20 years, last 20, 30 years. In the 1990s, Iran was trying to make better attempts at improving their relations. And in the 1990s, those efforts failed. And there were a few reasons why they failed. The supreme leader, number one, views the United States as the great Satan. Well, if you're a supreme leader who has a lot more power than you as president, says that the country you're trying to make some peaceful reparations with is a great saying. You as an Iranian president are very limited in your ability to improve the foreign policy of your country, even though in theory, you're supposed to be able to run it. In practice, the Supreme Leader wouldn't allow it. Number two, Iran's pursuit of nuclear and missile technology has made the West very mistrustful of why Iran is seeking it. And they fear that Iran would want to give these missiles to terrorists or other non-state actors. Thirdly, Ahmadinejad, President Ahmadinejad, elected in 2005, re-elected controversially in 2009, has been significantly more confrontational towards the West, making the relationship with the West worse. And last but not least, the US invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq convinced many Iranian leaders that they were going to be targeted next, and that only nuclear missiles might protect them from American aggression. Now, Iran's current global position is stronger, according to many, than at any moment since 1979, right? So since the end of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Iran has become more powerful because it's weakened enemies that they normally have had in Afghanistan and in Iran and in Iraq. Saudi Arabia fears Iran's rise, and both countries are openly hostile with one another. In fact, they actually have a proxy war in a country called Yemen that's very nearby, where Sunnis that are supported by Saudi Arabia are fighting a branch of Shiites who are supported by Iran, right? Now, while it's true that some people may consider Iran's current global position to be stronger, they are also more isolated, and they have less to offer ideologically than at any moment since the Iranian Revolution. Last but not least, as we do with every country, here's the labor force by occupation through percentages. Agriculture is 16% of Iranians' labor force. Industry is 35%. Services is 49%. Remember that in more industrialized countries, you're going to see that this services percentage is much higher, right? And so obviously Iran is still a developing country. It's still not a very rich country despite its mass oil wealth. And with that, we finish the lesson. I'll see you guys next class.